This diagram illustrates a paradox common among highly disciplined analysts, a perfectly constructed chain of reasoning that still produces the wrong conclusion. We see a single glowing origin node branching out into a pristine lattice of logic. The steps are flawless, yet the text on screen reveals the problem. Internal consistency does not equal external validity. When models fail, the structural collapse rarely exists in the mechanical links of the argument itself. The logic holds up. The failure lives here, vibrating at the very beginning. A single flawed assumption at the foundation skews the entire subsequent trajectory of the analysis. Every downstream calculation builds upon a premise that lacks stability. These assumptions do not enter the process through incompetence. They enter through cognitive economy. Cognitive economy is the mind's drive to bypass analytical effort by importing familiar, unexamined premises into new problems. We are going to map exactly how this drive to save mental effort enforces premature patterns on raw data, shields those patterns from scrutiny, and creates an illusion of certainty. An argument can be seamless, coherent, and utterly wrong. Logical smoothness is an illusion of fluency. It is not proof of external reality. Analytical errors rarely announce their arrival. They infiltrate quietly, disguising themselves as background knowledge, common practice, or habitual phrasing. The human brain exhibits a severe intolerance for ambiguity. When presented with chaotic signals, it forces them into a rapid, artificial order. Here is how that process looks in practice. An analyst views a stream of raw data points, spots a familiar cluster, and immediately drops a conceptual framing box around it. This mechanism is fast categorization, the mind's habit of assigning meaning and labels to cues at high speed, driven by pre-existing expectations rather than direct evidence. The moment that label attaches to the data, the raw observation vanishes. The mind completely discards the nuance, the outliers, and the specific context of the original information. The newly minted label takes over. It acts as an unquestionable fixed premise for all future calculations. By treating an early impression as a settled fact, the analyst trades accuracy for comfort. This locks the entire inquiry into a self-limiting framework from the very first moment of observation. Memory further distorts this foundation. Over time and under the pressure of professional environments, an analyst's recall of past events degrades. Time and stress strip the structural detail away. What remains in the mind are highly compressed outlines. These broad impressions completely lack the nuance and variation of the original, full information. Because the brain dislikes absence, it silently fills these memory gaps with manufactured inferences. These internal substitutes feel authentic. They aggressively mimic the original logic of a past event, but they lack any objective, factual grounding in the present. This diagram captures premature pattern formation. Premature pattern formation is the mind's tendency to force compressed memory fragments and thin data points into a coherent, recognizable shape before sufficient evidence exists. Spotting even a partial similarity to a past event triggers this process. The analyst projects the unverified, simplified shape onto the new, complex data. Once established, this projected shape acts as a strict filter. It permanently dictates which future evidence will be deemed relevant and which will be ignored. A conclusion drawn from a premature pattern is not an analysis of the subject. It is a dangerous projection of the analyst's own internal habits. As the pattern solidifies, a new risk emerges: overconfidence drift.
Overconfidence drift is the widening gap between an analyst's perceived certainty and their actual factual grounding. When an argument progresses step by step without friction, the ease of the process creates an illusion of correctness. The analyst mistakes cognitive fluency for analytical accuracy. The environment often accelerates this. When an analyst is expected to provide answers, the professional pressure to appear decisive forces their internal certainty upward, completely detaching it from the underlying evidence. To protect this high-momentum reasoning, the brain activates selective attention, a psychological defense mechanism that unconsciously filters incoming information. The geometric pattern moves forward, absorbing blue data points that match its shape. Confirming data is absorbed easily, requiring zero cognitive effort. Meanwhile, contradictory red points bounce off, systematically rejected. The mind classifies these as irrelevant noise to preserve narrative stability. An analyst's extreme confidence in a model does not mean the model is robust. It often merely reflects their successful, systematic suppression of contradictory evidence. This animation shows the inevitable result, an unexpected outcome. The flawlessly built, high-confidence model collides with reality and shatters. Analysts experience a deep psychological shock when their projections fail. This shock stems from the false assumption that dynamic environments will maintain predictable stability. We must stop treating these failures as isolated anomalies or unpreventable black swan events. An unexpected outcome is a pure diagnostic signal. It exposes a critical blind spot in the earliest moments of perception. The fracture of the model definitively proves that the underlying logic relied heavily on comfort, rapid categorization, and cognitive economy rather than actual data. When reality diverges from the projection, it proves the original boundaries of the inquiry were artificially narrow. Robust reasoning is not a natural cognitive state. Left alone, the mind defaults to speed and pattern matching. Accuracy requires a manufactured, deliberate slowing of thought. We enforce this through the internal review cycle, a systematic method to interrogate the earliest moves of an analysis. In this diagram, the scanning beam sweeps over the timeline, highlighting unverified foundational assumptions in bright yellow. Analysts must apply the exact same severity to these initial premises as they do to their final conclusions. We also leverage external disruption. By seeking peer input, we intentionally introduce structural friction into the model. We can see an external geometric force pressuring those unverified nodes. Analysts must treat external objections as maps of their own blind spots, not as attacks to defend against. When we allow outside perspectives to inject previously rejected data, the foundation adapts and strengthens. To finalize the discipline of correction, we use error mapping. Error mapping is the critical process of recording the exact topography and travel distance of past cognitive failures. This schematic represents an error topography map. Charting contextual triggers and failure points prevents the mind from treating mistakes as unrepeatable flukes. Documenting these pathways is the only reliable way to expose the recurring topologies of professional misjudgment. It forces invisible habits into plain sight. Continuous correction shifts the analyst's allegiance. They stop protecting early impressions and commit entirely to securing accurate foundations. True analytical strength does not arise from the speed or smoothness of logic. It arises from the relentless, uncomfortable inspection of the foundation upon which it rests.